Stewardship webinar. Karen will be with us momentarily. We are going to be talking about money, or Karen will be. My name is Janice Meehan. Oh, there's Karen. And I'm the development manager here in Stewardship and Planned Giving. And I will be on the other side taking your questions for Karen. So I'm turning it over to Karen.
Yay. All right. I see that the time is 1 p.m. and we still have people joining us, but that's okay. A few little housekeeping items just to remind everybody to keep their mics and cameras muted, and that way everyone can enjoy the conference. There is a chat bar that when you have questions, and there'll be times during the presentation that you are most welcome to ask questions. Actually, you can type in your questions anytime throughout it, and I'll be stopping and Janice will read them out and share them with us all. So that should be something that will be fun. I've got a number of PowerPoint slides, so you don't get to see me the whole time, which I'm glad to shut my camera off in a few seconds. But yeah, I think that 101, we're ready to begin. The slides will be posted on the webinar Wednesday, previous webinars for you to be able to download them, as well as the recording for this session. So if you missed some of it, or if you want to share it with anyone, feel free to watch the recording later. All right, so now I'm going to say goodbye and we're going to go over to the PowerPoint presentation. Okay. So what we wanted to do in this webinar is to talk about money and give you some practical language and ideas for presenting financial updates, asks, and thank yous in your congregation. Some of this might be building on the information that's been presented in previous webinars. So if you've been following along with us, some of this might be reminders, it might be said a slightly different way, and just begin to tweak your imagination. But I find, having worked now in stewardship for 11 years, that I can hear messages multiple times and they say different things every time I hear them. We're going to keep this webinar to an hour so that we don't take up your time, but we'll give you some ideas. So, just a little introduction to who I am. I'm the Associate Secretary for Stewardship and Planned Giving, and I've been in this role at the PCC for the past 11 years. Prior to that, I was the Communications Coordinator at Presbyterian World Service and Development from 1996 to 2007. And in both of these roles, I've had the opportunity to work with congregations and talk to them about building generosity and how they can use their gifts to further God's mission in many different ways. It's been lots of fun, and I've enjoyed my work very much. On a personal note, and it'll come up a little later, I'm a bit of a writer and have fun writing stories, and I'm also a sheep farmer. So just to give you an idea, this is where you will most often find me, and working at my desk and in my computer. But if you were to catch me on the weekend, you might be able to enjoy me with my sheep. And I can say sometimes I've learned as much lessons from my sheep as I have working with congregations. I think there's a real reason that sheep appear regularly in the Bible. So much to teach us. Okay. So, our plan for today. I'm hoping that we'll do a little bit of an introduction and broad strokes talking about money in the church and some of the language that we used. Then we're going to build on some of the teachings that we introduced in Stewards by Design, and that have been introduced to us by Dr. Kenan Callahan. So you'll see his name pop up on a number of the slides, and he's kindly given us permission to talk about and build upon the material that he gives us during this conference, which we run every 18 months and congregations are invited to come in groups of 4 with 4 key leaders and look at stewardship in depth. We'll be having another one in May, I think, 2019. So we're going to talk about money in the church. We're going to look at and understand motivation. We're going to look at some ideas for practical language for weekly and monthly reporting. practical language for a stewardship letter, and some language that we can use for saying thank you. So as we go along, if you're like, oh, I want to hear more about this, you can know a little bit what's coming up. So I thought I'd just share with you first a little story. I remember this so clearly when I was a university student and I first came to Toronto to attend U of T. I began attending congregations to see where I might want to find a new church family in Toronto. And it was interesting because the first couple of Sundays I think I had gone home, and so mostly I was visiting congregations at the end of September and at the beginning of October. And there I heard very many stewardship messages. It's interesting. It's a very common time for people to have their stewardship Sundays. And common message that I heard again and again was, we're behind on budget and we need your money. And I'm not sure even that it was quite fair to these congregations when I walked in the door and was there on their stewardship message. It probably wasn't the only message that they share, but because of the time that I was visiting them, it was the only message that I heard about. And from my years going to congregations, I know sometimes that's the only message that people think they hear about money. It's the one that stands out a lot, particularly right now in our congregations. So how do we change this? And how do we change this impression that people might have? First of all, that we're always talking about money and wanting money, and that we're behind on budget. One of the reasons that I began to work in stewardship, and one of the reasons why I was convinced to move to the stewardship department from the job I loved, which was in relief and development and communicating about that, was because I saw that stewardship is not about giving to a church budget, but it's the way that we respond to the call of God in our lives with all of our gifts, our time, treasure, and talent. Because I'm talking about money a lot in this webinar, we can sometimes forget that. And we can think stewardship is all about money, but it's really how we respond to God and what we do. And that's in many ways what I thought I was already doing in the communications role with the Relief and Development Agency. And so I was excited to be part of this ministry. And I hope that many of you are excited to be part of the stewardship ministries in your church. I definitely see stewardship as a spiritual discipline and very much an important part of the way we live our lives as Christians. So, if we do this, how do we talk about money in the church? Well, you might be surprised to hear that there's 2,530 passages in the Bible dealing with money and material possessions. That's more than any other subject, but it's often the least talked about subject in the church. And that has always struck me. I thought, oh, there is so much there. Now, luckily, we're not going to cover all 2,530 passages today, but I thought that I'd give you just a few of them, just to tweak your memories. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with these passages. So there's the passage in Luke where we find the Good Samaritan, where a Good Samaritan uses his money and his funds to care for the person he found along the side of the road. We've got the image of the woman who gives the perfume to anoint the feet of Christ. In Luke 18, we find a message about sell everything, give to the poor, follow me. Luke 19, 1-10, we see Zacchaeus, the tax collector, and how he uses his money to atone for his wrongdoings. In Acts, we find examples of believers who share all that they have, and Barnabas who sells a field. Chronicles talks about tithing, first fruits. Mark talks about the widow's offering. In Matthew, we see how our actions need to reflect where our money goes. And in Mark, we see the example of Jesus throwing money changers out of the temple. Any of these and all of these would form a great discussion for what does money do? What does it mean in your life? Where does it go? You'll see that not all of them talk about giving money. Some of them are about how we use money, how money impacts what we're doing. There's tons of material out there, and I think we could do a webinar on any one of these passages and really examine it. And they make great sermon material or Bible studies. The idea is that I want you to think we don't have to start with discussions about money talking about the budget or what's needed or how we're behind. We should be talking about it year-round and in different ways and looking at it in many different ideas. So that said, and I want to keep it in the back of your head, that sometimes we need to change the way we think. So we need to stop thinking that it's not Christian to talk about money, but instead start talking about it like Jesus does, and in many different ways. And then we have to sometimes stop thinking that we're poor and start thinking that God will give us what we need to do and what God wants done. Sometimes, and this is the hard thing, we need to stop thinking that people don't want to give and realize that people will give generously when given the opportunity. Lots of examples in the Bible, and I'm sure you can see lots of examples in your life as well. So, that said, there was a study that was done a number of years ago in the United Church, and they found a number of best practices that were happening in churches where there was very good stewardship, very good financial stewardship. And one of the things that they find that I wasn't surprised about, and I'm sure that you're not, is that stewardship and giving and talks about money and generosity were integrated into worship year-round. So there's talk about stewardship through the year from preaching and bulletins and children's messages. There were offering invitations that invite people to give as one way of connecting their lives with God's work in the world. And this is to say, because when it comes time to talk about money and giving, and as we encourage generosity in our churches, if it's the only time that we've talked about money, the message that, oh, we have to give to the church or that we're behind in the budget is the only message that will stick. But if we've talked about money and stewardship and giving all year round, then people will hear the other messages that we have to say. And it doesn't feel like it's out of place or something that's absolutely new. So another best practice that was tied to this is teaching stewardship was that these churches taught about stewardship regularly. So through Bible studies, Sunday school lessons, they would often offer personal finance training and budget counseling. They talked about major gifts and life gifts through planned giving. And so they really taught about stewardship. So this is to say, we don't want the language to come out of nowhere. We want it to be part of our faith and understanding, in that said. It's not that hard. I gave you a number of scriptures at the beginning, and the PowerPoint slides will be online. So if you're like, oh, I didn't get them all written down, you can not only watch the presentation again, but you could just look at the PowerPoint slides and you'll get all of those references. But a great one now, when you want to talk about giving and encouraging generosity, that's always sort of, I think, if you're going to work in stewardship and planned giving, is to look at the offerings that we're getting in 2 Corinthians. So 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, great passages to look at. What does the Bible teach us about giving? What does it teach us about encouraging generosity? And what does it teach us about receiving the offerings? So, and I'll just give you a few hints of this. 2 Corinthians 8:12, a great passage in that it looks at God's grace and reminds us that the generosity and the giving of the offering is very much about experiencing and seeing the grace of God. And I think if you keep this in your head and in your mind whenever it comes to talking about money and what it means when we invite people to participate in stewardship, that this is so important. So something great to really delve into that. That's 2 Corinthians 8:1. And then in 2 Corinthians 8:12, great principles here For if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has and not according to what one does not have. So God is looking for us to give out of the gifts that have been given to us, and we don't have to try and keep up with the Joneses or the neighbors and give in that way. Great teaching for us to explore more as we look into generosity and giving of the offering. The next one from 2 Corinthians 9:7, and I thought this one will be so familiar to you, I'll just show you a picture. This talks about God loves a cheerful giver. And it's just, I thought this was a great picture in doing the cheer. When we do Stewards by Design, Dr. Callahan talks a lot about having fun at the church and having fun with your stewardship ministry and having fun with the gifts that are given. I think sometimes we forget that and it becomes a serious message. So I think when we think about the language and the way we talk about money in the church, let's think about how we can have fun with it and the joy that comes from giving, how much this is very important and is connected to it. So those are some of the backgrounds there in terms to talking about money. I'm going to just see, does anybody have any questions yet?
Hi, Karen. There are no questions at the moment, so carry on.
Okay, great. I have a question, Sai, that is coming up again. And so if you've got questions that are popping into your head, feel free to type them into the chat bar and Janice will share them with me. So when it comes to, if somebody's on the phone and doesn't have the chat bar, you can feel free also to unmute and ask on the phone. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. So another best practice is to talk about mission. So congregations that had good stewardship practices were ones who were confident and clear about their mission, what was happening to the gifts that people were giving and what they were doing with them. Mission means connecting people to what is going on. Some of the most important motivations for people for why they want to give is that they want to make a difference and they want God to use them. So it's really important to be able to see how their gifts connect to this and how the church knows about the mission. Tell stories of mission, tell what's going on, share with what's going on with your church. I'm going to come up more specifically in a little bit for exactly how you can do this. But I just want to remind you to tell stories of mission. At Stewards by Design, we hear again and again how money follows mission. And so in many ways, we don't say, oh, here's the budget, we need money for this. We say, here's what we're going to do with your gifts. Please join us and be part of that. So one of the key things that we can do when we want to change our language or talk about it is to really understand people's motivation and why they give. And this directly comes from Dr. Callahan at Stewards by Design. There's been many studies, and this comes from psychology, about different things that motivate people. And this can be motivating them to sign up for a team. It can be motivating them to do something. It can be motivating them to give money, but it's just ways. What are the different ways? And so here are 6 motivations, most common motivations why people will do something. So the first one is compassion. They feel compassion for something. They want to share compassion. They've got love. That's a very strong motivator for why people will do that. People will become involved in projects. They'll give money because they want to build a sense of community. They want to be part of a community. That's why people join Facebook or social media, so that they can be part of a community that's broader than themselves and of people that they don't see every day. Community is a very strong motivator for many people. Also, hope. The idea that they can see hope. There's something out there that they want to see, that they want to change. They have hope. And hope will drive people to do for actions that they do, for getting involved in programs, for giving funds. There's also many people who are motivated by challenge. These are particularly athletes, for example, who want to achieve something by being involved in a race. It can be a goal to build a building. Challenge can be a way that people want to strive and reach a goal and go forward. Reasonability is a motivator. It looks at different science, for example. What's the rationale? People are convinced by something. They get involved with something because it's a reasonable thing to do. They look at what's going on and they make decisions based on reasonability. And the final one is commitment. People become committed to something. We get married and we stay committed for all those different years. They may become committed to a school, to something that they've said they'll be involved in. They become committed to a church. So these are 6 motivations, and it's really important to think about them because different people will respond differently to some motivations than others. So for example, somebody might be motivated by challenge, and that really gets them excited. Other people, challenge says nothing to them. They're more motivated by community. It's more important to them how they connect with people, how people see them, how they're helping people, what they're doing. So there's different, even though these 6 motivations all exist, there's different ways that people are motivated. So what does this have to do with giving? I know that you're all thinking now. Well, when we look at the 6 motivations and we think about language when it comes to talking about money in the church, and we think about our key leaders in the church. So these are our members of session, these are often our ministers, they're our lay leaders. The language that they often use to encourage giving or talking about money often are the last 3 motivators. It's language that often is connected with challenge, with reasonability, and commitment. Let me see if any of these things resonate with you. Here's a few examples of language that we would use that speaks to challenge, reasonability, and commitment. So for example, the thermometer. We've set a goal, so let's meet it. Many of you will get a mailing from me once a year that includes a thermometer that some of you post on your bulletin boards, and you fill out what your goal is for your congregation and for Presbyterian sharing. And people will color in, and they might even have fun coloring in the red and the black on the thermometer as to see the thermometer rising. That's to say that device that we use is speaking to somebody who's motivated by challenge. I want to help the thermometer reach the top. We've set a goal. Come on, let's meet it. Sometimes, and I'm sure many of you have been at least in a church that has heard the message, we're behind budget. Can't you just step up? That's a message that's based both on challenge and also has elements of reasonability in it, I think. It also actually can speak a little bit to commitment, because if you think, oh, we've committed to raising this budget or doing that, we should do that. Some other reasonable messages might be, it costs so much to heat and light the church or to pay our minister. This is a very reasonable thing. These are the costs and we need to do it. So that speaks to somebody who's motivated by reasonability. Also an argument like expenses are going up, so we need giving to increase. It's very reasonable. It's a little bit of a challenge, and there's commitment in there. Strong commitment messages might include, as a member of the congregation, it's part of your responsibility to help pay bills or for us to work together. And also then what you do with your money is a discipleship issue. There's nothing wrong with any of these messages, but for somebody who's motivated by compassion, community, and hope, they might not speak to them. And if they're the messages that we're predominantly using when we're talking about money and encouraging giving in our congregations, then we might turn people off. We can take a few lessons from other nonprofits, from schools and hospitals and relief and development, that really speak in language of compassion, community, and hope. The reason that they do this is that they know people, everyone, whether they're key leaders and ministers and session members or the people who've walked in off the street, to the members of the congregations, the adherents, that they can all relate to the messages of compassion and community and hope. Let me give you a few examples of how we can change the message to one that everyone can commit to. It's not to say we don't have to ever talk in language of challenge, reasonability, or commitment, but it's saying if we begin to talk in compassion, community, and hope, people begin to hear a different message, and they can really begin to get excited about what they are getting involved in. So you have to think, what's the impact that people's gifts are having? How are they getting involved in God's mission? How are they being part of it? So a few examples, and I'm sure you can think of many, many more. Oh, Elisa in our Sunday school, she's learning about Jesus. People get really excited about kids. They get really excited about individuals. The more you can put a face on people's name, the better it is even there. You could talk about things that the lunchtime ministry music has provided, what it does, how it provides a time of worship and encouragement for downtown workers or for seniors in communities. Whatever it is, what's the heart of it? How's the impact of your program or project having on people? How can people connect to that? You may talk about Susan and James being transformed in their Bible studies. You may share dreams of what you hope that you can do and what you can do together. So this is just sort of a shift when you can think, oh, am I using language of challenge, reasonability, or commitment, or am I speaking in languages of compassion, community, and hope? And I'd particularly encourage you to look at compassion. That language where people are sharing love, the love of God, the love of Christ, is so important, and it's so key to our message. I often say that when somebody is talking to you about cancer and why it's important to give to the Cancer Society, they don't say, well, we have to pay the executive director and the researchers, and we've got to pay our light bills and our utilities. They say, do you know anyone who's had cancer? Or here's a story of somebody who has had cancer, and this is how we've made a difference. This is how the support groups make a difference. This is the research that we're doing to cure cancer so that people don't have to experience the trauma and sorrow of losing a loved one. That's how we change our language from compassion to compassion when we began to make connections like that. So let me remind you, as we begin to encourage generosity in the church, we have to remember that people don't give their money to the church. It's not about giving to a church budget. Instead, they give through the church to touch the lives of other people. And people will give generously when they feel their money is making a difference and when they feel that it's part of God's work and mission and ministry in the world. This message cannot be repeated again and again or enough. And it's kind of funny. I think we all know it, and yet it's so easy to slip back into words that we feel comfortable with. Probably because most of us are key leaders, and we're mostly motivated by challenge and reasonability and commitment. I certainly know that I am. So it can be so easy to slip back into the other language. This reminds me, and was a saying that in order to encourage generosity, we need to remember, scolding doesn't raise giving. It raises fear and anxiety, and people give less. So we need to think about the ways and the language that we use. So that said, I'm going to go into a few tips for how we can use language and how we can apply this if we're writing letters and encouraging people to give. And I'm going to use an example that comes from very generic church. And this is what we call the discouragement letter. And this is something some of you may have even experienced or seen in your mailboxes. Dear so-and-so, hope everything is going well for you. Just want to let you know, this letter often comes in October. We're a little bit behind in our bills. Our utilities are costing a little more. Can you please send us a little more money? So if we think about this, how this type of letter can raise fear and anxiety in people who are part of our congregations. Well, what happens if instead we write an encouragement letter? So what if we share with them the things that are going on in the church? Dear so-and-so, right now is we've just had the best Easter ever. We're excited to see God at work in our community and through our congregations. Share a little bit about the people who've been helped, about the lives that have been transformed, and thank people for their generosity and being part of this mission. Do you see how the language changes? Do you feel better about it? I think I already feel better about the messages that are there. So, what are a few tips if you want to write an encouragement letter? Or if you want to write an encouragement letter and you're near the year end and you want to encourage people to be a part of the generosity of your, and stewardship ministry of your church. Here's a few ideas. First of all, make your case quickly. Share about your congregation right at the top of the letter and get to the point right away. Where do they see God at work? Where do you see God at work? What dreams will gifts fulfill? People give. How will they share compassion? How do they share God's lives? Whose people's lives will be changed? Remember that people give to people. So if you're writing a year-end of a fundraising letter, something that's asking people to get involved, inviting them into your stewardship ministry, remember that they give to people. And I loved this. I found this online. It says, a strong protagonist brings, and this is the writer in me. So a strong protagonist person brings your fundraising letters live because people give to people. Most people don't want to read about programs and policies. They want to read about people you help and the people doing the help. So I think you can share the stories in many different ways. Share stories of great members of your congregations, of the people involved in your programs, of the impact that it's having on their lives. Get people encouraged to know that they're involved in this. Another great tip, though, is lose the hype. Be very sincere in any letters that you're writing. Be sure that you don't exaggerate or overextend yourself. Nothing destroys credibility faster than sounding like a used car salesperson when raising funds for a good cause. So be sure that as you're doing this, you're very sincere. And sometimes I think you may have to take moments and really write your letter first from the gut and then come back and say, oh, how are people reading this? How can they see it? We can get overexcited with our enthusiasm, but we just want to make sure that we really keep our letters and our information sincere. Here's something that anyone who knows me or has worked with me will think, what is she saying? But longer might actually be better. I, for the most part, like to keep things fairly succinct. But if you're writing an encouragement letter, be sure that you've got good content. And while most people won't read every word, the more you can tell the reader about the benefits of giving, what's going on in the congregation, how their funds are making a difference, where God is at work, the better response you'll receive. People can skim the letter, but they have to know that there's actually something that's being happened. So don't make it longer by putting in lots of extra superfluous information, but just be sure that it's good content. But really, don't be scared. Just share with them the different stories, all the different ways that your congregation is doing and having an impact. So share the Sunday school stories, share the Bible story, the Bible study stories, share what's going on in the congregation, the mission projects, the outreach. Get them excited because there's lots of things going on and they can be part of it. If you're writing an encouragement letter at year end, or if you're writing a fundraising letter, don't forget to ask. Sometimes don't just tell them about your program, but ask directly for their help. And you might want to give examples so they have an idea of what is needed. Now this, if you're doing sort of a general encouragement letter, then encouraging them to give, then you might not want to have examples, but if you're doing, because it might limit people to what they can think. But if you're doing a fundraising campaign or raising something for something specific in your church, concrete examples of how their money can make a difference can be very, very helpful. I saw a question pop up and we're coming very close to question time. So if you have some, come up. The final tip I will have is, here's something, show pictures. I grabbed a few pictures from our mission trips just to show you the difference. I can write a letter and talk about how mission trips change people's lives and how they work with our partners around the world to encourage them in their ministries. But if I show a few pictures of real people that capture the compassion and the hope in that, this can say 1,000 words. So don't be afraid to find pictures and be able to tell the stories. So the other thing I'm going to come back to before I come to questions is sometimes we can work compassion, community, and hope into our commitment messages. So I don't know if there's any congregations out there who are using pledges, but there's a number who find it helpful. So rather than saying, this is how much we're going to give to the church, be sure to work your message into this so it recognizes and incorporates this. So here's an example that came from Stewards by Design and Dr. Callahan. We're grateful for the compassion and generosity of God's gifts in our lives. We're thankful for the hope which God blesses us, and we generously pledge to advance God's mission in 2019. And somebody could fill it out. My last reminder, as we say that again, though, is stewardship is not about giving to a church budget, but responding to the call of God in our lives with all our gifts, time, treasure, and talent. So now, time for questions.
Hi, Karen. We have one question from Karen, and she's asking, she's had someone say that they don't want the congregation to look like the Cancer Society with long letters and stories. A person from, it's in her congregation, it's from a commitment group. So she's asking, should we have different letters for different people?
Oh, absolutely. If you know the people in your congregation and you know how they would respond to messages, I think that's, then tailor messages to them and share with them the information that you want. And I think it's really important to say that I'm not saying that you don't share, you don't share where's budget and where are we behind, or people who want to say, oh, I want to know what, how much do the utilities cost and what are all these breakdowns. People who want to know that information, we should be open and transparent. But I think most people would be looking for both. So, I mean, it's rare for me to hear, oh, I don't want to hear stories about how things are going, unless they kind of are on the inside track a little bit. So I can see this, somebody coming from a session who's a member of session maybe, or a lay leader who's involved in the church. And if you've been talking about that, they'd be like, oh, I don't need to hear that. I'm quite fine with hearing what the church needs, and I'll respond that way. So yeah, for sure. Then don't share with them those stories, but most people will be interested in the stories. And I think it's important too that you think about information, how it's shared and where it's shared and when it's shared. So for example, the information you share with your session and your elders, they're going to want to know more details about what's going on. They want to see organizational transparency. All of this is important. The challenge, the commitment, the reasonability is really important to share with them. But when you're talking about money in your worship service, where you've got a mixture of leaders and a mixture of people who are just members and who come to worship with you, and maybe some people who've just walked off the church or the street and who don't come to church very often, and you're doing an open invitation to them, sharing the stories and the impact is what will speak to everyone in the congregation. And so that's where I want to say, oh, when you're sharing the message with your congregation, to be sure to couch it. And I'm going to talk about in a few minutes messages that you put in your bulletin or that you share from the lectern during your time for information and messages. And I'm going to talk about how we can switch our language a little bit just so that it changes that. So great question. Thank you. All right.
We have one more question. It's from Bill, and he said, I understand what you're saying, but when most of the money is spent on stipend and utilities, etc., and missions relatively a smaller portion, are you being realistic about the impact of the expenditures?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I would say to join us next month or to watch the webinar that we had on narrative budgets to look at ways that you can talk about how stipend and utilities actually contribute to the impact of the expenditures. So for example, look at where does your minister spend the time and how are they sharing compassion with people in the communities. There we go. Look at what is the building used for, and how does that, what's the impact of the building? So for example, if it's used for worship, we know that once a week people coming for worship. If it's used for Bible study, if it's used for children's programs, how's it used for outreach? You might provide a space for the community to come and share, and then talk about the impact of that. We provide a space where community members can come and share and ask questions and do all of that. So it's sort of look at what you're doing with those resources, look at what's being done with the stipend and the utilities, and then frame it in that way. Okay.
Great, thanks.
Another great question. Another great question. Okay, so I'm going to talk, before I go a little bit more, the importance of saying thank you. And we did a whole webinar on just saying thank you. So I'm just typing, or going to hit a couple of the highlights of that. Let's see if I can get this to move forward again. There we go. Thank you. So I want to say, cannot emphasize too much the importance of saying thank you, both to your congregation and to the people who support the ministry that you're doing. Feel free to say thank you in many different ways. Say thank you to people for their regular gifts. This may be a year-end thank you. It may be something as well, though, that you introduce partway through the year. Be sure to thank them and let them see what's the impact having, what's being done, how are they part of God's ministry. Share the enthusiasm that you have for the mission and ministry your congregation is doing with them. Say thank you for special gifts. When you've had a special offering to share, to send some kids to Vacation Bible School perhaps, or to collect funds to respond to the Syrian disaster that's going on, be sure to thank the people for their special gifts. You can share thank you statements to people throughout the year that shows gratitude. And in those statements, you can also say this is what's happening. This is the impact that it's having. And be sure that in your encouragement letter, you're saying thank you and you're really encouraging people about what's going on. So then when it comes, so that's really important, and I just don't want us to forget that. Check out on our previous webinar page just different ways that you can say thank you and the impact of saying thank you. But then it comes to that question, what about when we want to give regular feedback to the congregation? How can we do this and what can we do? Well, first of all, I do want to encourage you to report giving back regularly and celebrate the gifts that have been given. You can report progress towards goals and how you're doing. Again, this is speaking to challenge language and commitment language, but there's lots of people who will relate to it. But do it in a way so that you also share the enthusiasm and compassion that goes with it. You may want to use a stewardship minute weekly in your congregation. You can find moments on our website that will just get people thinking about money and what it means and what their money can mean when it's given. Use those photos. I know more and more congregations have projection in their services, and it's just a great way to visually show the difference that your money can have. And then you can provide regular updates in a church bulletin or newsletter. Now, your church bulletin. I'm going to show you something, and I wish I could see your heads nodding. If you've seen this in a congregation that you attend, or one near you, or one that you've attended, or one that you visited. This is not an uncommon message that we have in our bulletin announcements, often echoed in letters that we will send to our congregations in the fall, encouraging things. It'll be something like this. Well, this is the money that's needed. $8,333 to reach our monthly budget. This is the amount that we received, $6,500. And so this is the amount that we are short, $1,833. Well, that can be rather discouraging. It goes along with the discouraging. But what if we change it just a little bit? The first thing what we need to do is that when we look at our line that says needed, is what does that really mean? Is it the goal? And is it a realistic goal? And how did we achieve it? So did we achieve it by taking the church budget and dividing it by 12 and then letting people that this is what we need for the month? Or did we look at past giving patterns and say this is how much was given last year at this time, and so this is where we're at or achieved? So let me just go to the next one. What happens if we did this? If instead of saying needed, we say our goal? What does that say? How does it change your response to the thing? It sort of becomes about from what the church needed and what is needed for the church budget to a goal, something that's aspirational that you're inviting people to join together with you. The goal should be based on previous giving patterns. So we should know and remember that money doesn't come into the church all at the same time. If your congregation is like many congregations, givings will be less in January, February, March. In March and April, May and June, they may pick up. They may go down again in July and August while people are away for the summer, and then pick up again near the end of the year. So look at the patterns so that you can see where people really are. And then when people have been given, whatever people have given for that year, you can report that. So in this example, the goal was $6,000 and $6,500 was given. You can say, well done, and celebrate that. But I can already see you guys thinking, well, what if we're in decline? And what if the amount isn't given that hasn't reached that much? You can still report your goal based on previous giving patterns or what you think that will come in so that you could meet your budget for this year. And let's say $5,500 was given. Well, still say well done and celebrate it. People can read the lines. They can see that you're a little bit behind the goal. They will know that people needs to be done. They don't have to hear it again and again announced from the pulpit. And they still want to be celebrated for the gifts that they've been given and that they've achieved. And isn't that great? This is what our church is doing. So this is important. I think it is important, and you can still report giving regularly to your congregation and progress to your goals. But the language you use is important. And let me just remind you one. So the language we moved from is needed and received. So needed and received, which is very focused on the church, to a goal, which sounds more collegial, and then given. It recognizes that people have given these gifts. And it celebrates all the gifts that have come in. In your communication, when it comes to giving and encouraging generosity, be sure to be caring of all members. And I can't say this much as well. Be sensitive to those who have little money to give by celebrating all the gifts that people give in many different ways. So don't just talk about gifts of money. Be sure to talk about gifts of time and talent, encouragement, even just presence. What does it mean to have somebody present every week at worship? That's a gift. To be there alongside you, singing, worshiping, praying, might not seem like a lot, but that's a gift. So be sure that you're talking about this language in many different ways. We're just at 10 to 2. So if people have any more questions in the chat window, Janice will ask them for you. The other thing that I wanted to say, if any of you are interested in working on an encouragement letter or stewardship letter that you've been working on, you want to send to your congregation, and if you want to send it to me to read over and see if I've got ideas or suggestions for how you could use language that would be encouraging, that uses compassion and hope, I'm happy to look at them and suggest ways that language can be used. Sometimes this can be a very sort of abstract discussion, and when you sit down to write the letter, you think, oh, now what can I actually say? The other thing I would suggest is you can Google lots of sample letters. You'll be surprised how much is out there. Feel free to build on and adapt and language for yourself that has been used by other congregations.
That's great, Karen. There are no questions yet coming in on the chat, so I would say continue on.
Okay, good. Well, the main thing that we're going to say now is just that, yeah, here's the contact information if you want to send in letters, if you want to say this is ideas that I have. How do you think it will work? How do you test out some language? Feel free to send it. So there's the contact information there. And I want to introduce you to our next stewardship webinar, which will happen on April 4th, 2018. And it's a case study that we have, which will be shared with you, on narrative budgets and practical tools. So the Reverend Mark Tremblay will be sharing some practical tools that Knox Calgary has used over the years to construct their narrative budget. If you haven't watched the narrative budget webinar, feel free to review it or to watch it for the first time. But he's going to really share with you what they learned in their congregation, what has worked and what hasn't worked, how it's helped, and the difference it's made in the congregation. So it's really great because it will be one in-depth case study from one congregation. So again, one on narrative budget was called Sharing Your Story in a Way That Inspires. Yeah, other than that, that's all I have for today. So if there's no more questions, we'll wrap it up.
There are no further questions, and thank you everyone for being with us here today for the stewardship webinar.
Signing off.